Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. There's an old saying that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. So I always look at everything that's going on in the world from a historical perspective. And from my perspective, from a historical perspective, it very much appears as though the United States is making the same mistake that we made in Vietnam. There's a thing called escalation. We really get introduced to this concept historically in Vietnam. And what starts out as support for the southern half of Vietnam during a prolonged Vietnam Civil War and division of that country into two halves following French occupation of what was then called Indochina, that you see that we start to support and prop up a dictator in South Vietnam as a buffer against a communist takeover coming from the north. And we are involved in essentially a civil war in Vietnam that escalates. We start out by just sending money, then we send materials, then we send weaponry, then we send military advisors to teach the people how to use the weaponry. And then a thing really changes everything. An incident changes everything. The incident I'm referring to is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Before I go further in talking about the Gulf of Tonkin, I want to remind you this channel is supported by viewers like you. There's links in the description to PayPal and to Cash App. You can make contributions to make sure this channel stays on the air and these videos keep coming. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is a very controversial story. It essentially, the basics are this: that during this civil war going on in Vietnam, where we have advisors on the ground in South Vietnam teaching the Vietnamese how to fight, we have weapons and materials and money flowing into South Vietnam to aid them in their civil war against the North. When a U.S. naval vessel on a regular patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin encounters a North Vietnamese torpedo boat. And what happens next is a matter in some degrees of conspiracy theory, and in others there's their story and our story and the truth, right? But at some point this North Vietnamese naval boat fires on a United States vessel. The controversy is whether it was hit or not. The captain of that vessel claimed it was a warning shot. He was not authorized to fire weapons at U.S. vessels. He was, according to North Vietnamese history, he was removed from command and treated as a rogue actor and prosecuted for his actions that day. But nonetheless, Lyndon Baines Johnson took that as the excuse or as the motivation to go into a full-blown war in Vietnam, where over 58,000 United States soldiers lost their lives. I believe that's the correct number. Now, what does that have to do with Ukraine? What does that have to do with what's going on right now? We are going down the exact same pathway of escalation that brought us into the Vietnam War. We started with supporting them financially in Ukraine during this Ukrainian civil war. Essentially, that's what it is. It had been going on for years before Russia got involved on the other side. And we are following this same pathway of escalation. First money, then weapons, then trainers and advisors. And all we lack for full war between the United States and Russia breaking out in Ukraine is a Gulf of Tonkin type incident. And even as we speak, there are Russian Navy vessels in Cuba, in and around Cuba. We sent our forces to shadow them from the United States Navy and the Canadian Navy. And at one point this week, both Russian ships, Canadian ships, and U.S. warships were all docked side by side in the bay in Cuba. And so we have this very close proximity, this game of cat and mouse being played out in the Mediterranean with the Russian Navy and the United States and Canadian Navy. And it's ripe for a incident to occur that could shadow historically the Gulf of Tonkin incident. All it takes is one misunderstanding. All it takes is one clash. All it takes is a minor damage to a United States vessel, and it would give us the excuse that our government's been wanting to fully invade Ukraine and go to war directly with Russia in Ukraine. What is the big difference between Vietnam and Ukraine? Well, one thing you need to understand that already Russia is involved in Ukraine to a greater degree than we were involved at its height of the Vietnam War. By some estimates, 100,000 Russians have been killed in this war already, almost double in just 2 years to what had occurred in Vietnam over the course of nearly a decade. So the casualty numbers in Ukraine are enormous. For the Russians, the war in Ukraine is paramount. It's the center of their focus. It's their whole world, as was the Vietnam War for us in the 1960s and 70s, but to a much greater degree. Degree number one, it's on their border, right? This fighting is happening on their border. And so they have a dog in this fight because of the proximity of this Ukrainian civil war that they involved themselves in. And America is going to be dragged into this proxy war. The difference between Vietnam War and the war in Ukraine is the war in Ukraine is on Russia's border. Attacks have already occurred from Ukrainian forces backed by United States money, weapons, and advisors. And in some cases, people believe actual U.S. Army or military personnel are programming, guiding, and providing intel for the attacks into Russia on behalf of Ukraine. And that is something that didn't occur in Vietnam. There were no attacks on... Vietnam was a proxy war between the communists, Chinese, and Russians, and the United States. But no bombs were lobbed into China. No weaponry was loosed on the Soviet Union. And so it was very much controlled in a border war with very distinct borders, far away from the proxy parent, okay? Far away from the Soviets and the United States. This war in Ukraine is on Russian border. Another thing, Ukraine was at one time part of the Soviet Union. And people want to say that Putin's a liar when he says that the heart of Russia starts in Ukraine, in Kiev, depending on how you pronounce it. And I can attest to that as a student of history, especially studying religious Christian history, that the Eastern Orthodox Church converts Russia from paganism to Christianity, and the Russian Orthodox Church is established in Kiev. It was the Ukrainian Russians before there was the Moscow Russians. That all of the Russian nation really has its roots in Kiev, the ancient city that goes clear back to the time of the Byzantine Empire. So to say that Russia is a part of, that Ukraine's a part of Russia is like saying that Texas is a part of the United States. One way to look at this is, what if Texas declared its independence from the United States and the United States let Texas go without a fight? Understanding that Texas and the United States are the same, right? Same people, we have the same values for the most part. And if Texas wants their independence, we just give it to them, all right, in this scenario, okay? There's an old saying that if you want to understand someone, walk a mile in their moccasins, right? And so this is flipping the script here. This is showing you what it would be like if this was going on the border of the United States. What if Texas seceded from the Union, and then immediately Russian and Chinese provocateurs, they're intelligence agencies got involved in Texas politics and put in place a dictator backed by Russia and China in Texas. And then a Texas civil war broke out between the communists and the free Americans in Texas for control of Texas. Would the United States get involved? Would they get involved to fight back this communist takeover of Texas if Texas had seceded from the Union at some point? The answer is absolutely yes. Not only that, we would feel connected to Texas. We would feel obligated to protect them from these outside provocateurs. And no matter how much money and equipment the Chinese and Russians, poured into Texas, the American government would pour more into Texas. They would intercede on behalf of the Texans to put a stop to a dictator backed by Russia or China. See, when you flip it around, you start to see that Russia has a real dog in this fight. This isn't Vietnam for them. This is World War III for them. This is defense of the homeland for them. This is everything for them. And they are resolved to win in Ukraine, no matter what it takes, even if it triggers World War III. But for us, this is very much like Vietnam was in the 1960s. We have incrementally, through our support of Ukraine, been dragged into this. And our military's pushing for it. Our military wants a war in Ukraine with American boots on the ground. They want a draft. They want massive funding from the U.S. Treasury. They want carte blanche to go in there and make war. Really, some of them want war with Russia. They want to put Russia away once and for all. And so they're pushing on our civilian government, who, quite frankly, engineered this takeover in Ukraine. They wanted to make Ukraine a NATO nation and put military assets on the ground in the form of NATO forces in Ukraine, and put nuclear weapons eventually in Ukraine pointed right at Russia. Russia couldn't have that, right? That's another reason they're fighting. They're fighting to defend the Russian people in eastern Ukraine who rebelled against western Ukraine's NATO-backed government, right? It's a contested election. Since the war broke out, Zelensky in Ukraine has outlawed his opposing party. Can you imagine in the United States if the Democrats just said it's illegal to be a Republican? You're not allowed to put up any Republican congressmen, no Republican senators, no Republican representatives. In fact, we're dissolving the Republican Party and making it as illegal as the Nazi Party, making it as illegal as the Communist Party used to be in the United States. We're going to outlaw Republicans and remove them all from Congress. Oh, by the way, since we're having war, we're going to send Congress and the Senate, we're just going to send you home. And we're going to suspend elections. This is what's happening in Ukraine. Zelensky suspended the election, so he's now officially a dictator with no elected backing, right? He uses War Powers Acts to seize the government in a dictatorship. And on top of that, he outlawed his opposition party. So there is no democracy in Ukraine. We're fighting for democracy in Ukraine, if you hear the Biden administration and the leftists talk about it. But the fact of the matter is, U.S. involvement in the Ukrainian politics has ensured that there is no democracy in Ukraine right now. It's a dictatorship. It's a military dictatorship. And so for Russia, this is bigger than Vietnam was for us. But for us, this is another Vietnam. This is shaping up to be another Vietnam, but with much higher stakes. Because if we get involved in Ukraine in direct action against the Russian army, see, that's the thing. This was a proxy war until Russia got involved. Now, for us, it's a proxy war, but for Russia, it's a real war. And if we join the proxy war, it's war with Russia. If we get pulled in like we did in Vietnam, if there's a Gulf of Tonkin type of incident that causes the United States to escalate and put troops on the ground, put NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine, then we are officially at war with Russia. It will quickly escalate to a regional European war. I think most Americans miss the idea and concept and reality that the Ukrainian war is already the biggest war in Europe since World War II. As it sets right now, it's the biggest war since World War II in Europe. And the only one that's bigger worldwide was the Congo War in Africa. And so America missed that for the most part. That was a bloody war. But since World War II, this is the big one. The Ukrainian war is already the big one. And we're not officially involved in it right now. But all it takes is one incident, one Gulf of Tonkin incident. It could be an incident that happens in the harbor in Cuba. It could be an incident that happens off the coast, east coast of the United States with these patrol boats and these exercises that are going on and being shadowed by the U.S. Navy forces and Canadian forces. That this could easily produce a Gulf of Tonkin incident, which could cause the Congress, especially if it's Democrat-controlled and the Senate is mostly Democrat-controlled. All it's going to take is some Republicans, and there's plenty of them. Let's make this clear. In this situation in America, it really isn't Democrat against Republican. It's rhinos and leftists working together in Ukraine, and patriots who don't want war are kind of caught in the middle. So all it's going to take is for some incident to occur, some naval misunderstanding, some ship gets fired upon in the Mediterranean, and you could get a Gulf of Tonkin Act type congressional act passed that would give Biden full reign to conduct war in Ukraine. And it is easily to see how that could mean that we have to attack Russia mainland. We can't just fight their forces in Ukraine. We'd have to hit their missile launchers, their radar installations, their infrastructure, their gas refineries, their electric production facilities, their nuclear power plants, their power grid, right? Their computer systems. It would be full war. And all it takes is one rogue Navy captain to take one shot at an American vessel like the Gulf of Tonkin. And you will have an escalation that none of us could imagine, and it will happen so quickly. The draft was immediately instigated in the Vietnam War, and the draft of this era, because feminists won the fight for equal rights in the battle of the sexes of the 1970s and 80s. Now we have an integrated military of men and women, and therefore women of draft age would also be included in this draft. That men and women between the ages of 18 and 26 would more than likely be pulled into an immediate draft upon any kind of Tonkin resolution type act that comes out of Congress due to some escalation that occurs. That we're putting good money after bad. We're making the exact same mistakes that Kennedy and then LBJ made in escalating the Vietnam War, leading to the death of 58,000 Americans, and it nearly tore our country apart. See, we didn't really have a dog in the fight. The domino effect that we have to stop communism in Southeast Asia just didn't ring true for the average American. And when body bags started coming back, when coffins draped with American flags started coming home, then the American people lost their desire to fight. And the young men and women that were being drafted started refusing to go. And draft riots and draft protests started. And I can see that happening in this case because we don't have a dog in the fight in Ukraine. When you have a nation that's literally defending its border, when it's fighting for people that have been oppressed on its side, and when they see a foreign country from across the ocean intervening in their politics and in their war and in their internal issues, right? They have a real dog in the fight. This is happening on the border. There's already been strikes into Russia. Russia is in this war. The people are behind it. Their recruitment rate is through the roof. That they got people jumping up to be involved in this Ukrainian war in Russia. You have a total mobilization, a World War II level mobilization of the civilian population behind this war in Ukraine that's happening in Russia. America does not have that resolve. We didn't for the Vietnam conflict, and we won't for this one either. And when American bodies start coming back from the war zone, when American coffins draped in American flags start coming back to this continent, when they start to experience the loss of their own children, America will not be happy. Americans, your average American, will not support this war. But once you're in it, it's almost too late. And here's the biggest problem that I see with the Ukrainian war, is that in the case of Vietnam, Vietnam was isolated. If we walked away from Vietnam, yes, we might be betraying trust of the Vietnamese people. We might be abandoning South Vietnam. But it has a way of being over, right? We just pull our people out and it's over. The difference between that and Ukraine is because Russia is so vested in the Ukrainian war that it could easily escalate into a direct warfare between Russia and the United States. That means targets in the United States being hit by Russian missiles, targets in Russia being hit by American missiles fired from American airplanes, piloted by American pilots, fired from artillery being manned by American soldiers, and pull us into World War III. And then I won't even get started on China's involvement and how they're waiting with bated breath, surrounding the island nation of Taiwan, and they want to take it back. And they're just waiting for the United States and Western forces to get in deep enough in this Ukrainian war that we're committed over there and would be hard-pressed and to defend Taiwan. And they'll invade Taiwan and open a second war front in the Pacific. This has all the makings of World War III. We are making the same mistakes we made going into Vietnam, except the stakes are way higher because Ukraine is not isolated from Russia, right? This is happening on Russia's border. And the attacks are happening inside Russia proper right now, even as we speak on a daily basis. Russia's getting hit inside their own borders. So they're committed to this in a way that we can't be. And that's going to give them the advantage when all hell breaks loose. And if we don't do something, if we don't pull back our support, if we don't press for peace, right now some kind of peace initiative is underway in Europe, and but I don't expect it to go far because the Russians were invited. How can you have a peace summit when both sides are not present? So I don't know how far this is going to go peace-wise, but I do know if we don't find a path to peace in Ukraine, if we don't find a way to save face and pull our resources back, if we allow escalation to occur in the exact same way it happened in Vietnam, we will suffer the same kind of butt whipping that we got in Vietnam. And then on top of that, we're going to be involved in World War III. The stakes are much higher. The consequences of winning and losing in Ukraine are much higher. And a wise man will look at that and say, we don't want any part of that. Sue for peace now. Split Ukraine down the middle, give Russia the half they wanted, demilitarize Ukraine, pull American forces, American advisors, and American weapons out of Ukraine, and reduce our involvement financially with Ukraine to humanitarian aid alone. And sue for peace with Russia. If we don't encourage Ukraine to surrender half of their country to Russia, then all of these things I'm talking about are going to happen, and it very well could escalate into full-blown World War III on multiple fronts, which would undoubtedly include at least tactical nuclear weapons, if not strategic long-range nuclear warfare. The stakes are much, much higher. And our chances of winning are much, much lower than in Vietnam because Russia is defending its own border. I'm not a Russophile. I'm not a person who likes Russia. I grew up with the communists being the enemy. And they are still the enemy to me, especially the communists that have taken over parts of the United States government and the United States military. Those communists are the worst enemy, in my opinion. So I'm no fan of Russia, but I'm here to tell you, the American people are not ready for this war. We're stepping into a situation that will escalate quickly and make our only option become a nuclear one. Are you ready for explosions, both conventional and possibly nuclear, to happen on the East Coast of the United States? Are you ready for war to break out in China? Are you ready for a civil war to happen simultaneously? The Titor timeline is hot. If you don't know what the Titor timeline is, dig around in my channel and you'll find out. This is a classic example of escalation. And if we don't learn our lessons from Vietnam, we're going to find ourselves bogged down in another civil war in a country we got no business being in. And the difference is that puts us now in direct conflict with Mother Russia, a nuclear-armed nation. As a preacher, I feel an obligation to always pray for peace, to always encourage peace, to always encourage de-escalation. And in this Sunday sermon, I'm going to take off the war hat and, take the preacher chair, take the pulpit on Sunday, and talk this virtual pulpit I have, and talk to you about the role that pastors and ministers play in war, and what our obligations are and where we fall in this. This time of uncertainty needs to be met by calmer heads prevailing, that the big picture needs to be examined, and we do not need to get caught in the tit for tat, in the action and reaction of escalation that would cause this to become World War III. Unfortunately, I'm a voice crying in the wilderness, and very few people are saying what I just said to you. Too few. Take up the mantle of peace. Take up the bully pulpit of de-escalation. We need to make our voices heard before American servicemen start coming home in flagged, draped coffins. If you learned something from this video, if you appreciate what I'm trying to do here, please support this channel through your gifts in PayPal and Cash App, links in the description, to my post office box, also found in the description. And like and subscribe, and check your subscription and notifications. Make sure you haven't been unsubscribed. And we'll see you next time for the end of the world as we know it.